There is a city at the edge of Europe. It sits at a narrow crossing of water where the Baltic and the North Sea once argued over territory, where fishermen first drove their stakes into the muddy shallows and decided here, right here. It has been leveled by fire, twice, bombarded by a foreign fleet, occupied by Nazi soldiers who marched down its cobblestone streets while its people watched in silence, calculating. It has buried tens of thousands to cholera, survived sieges, revolutions, and plagues, lost an empire, and found itself, and yet it stands. More beautiful, perhaps, than it has ever been. More confident, more itself. This is the story of Copenhagen, not a myth, not a fairy tale. The truth which, as it turns out, is far more extraordinary. The Sound and the Bishop. Prehistory, 1167. Long before the city had a name, the crossing mattered. For thousands of years, the narrow Strait of Öresund was among the most strategically valuable passages in northern Europe. Anyone who controlled it controlled trade between the Baltic Sea and the open Atlantic. The fishermen who worked its waters understood this. The Norse kings, who eventually emerged from the mist, understood it too. By the time the Viking Age was in full swing, roughly the 8th through 11th centuries, the area we now know as Copenhagen was home to small fishing and trading settlements. Archaeologists have found evidence of occupation dating back to the 10th century on the island of Slotsholmen, a small natural platform in a shallow harbour that would one day hold the seat of Danish royal power. The name of the place in those early days was Haven, simply the harbour, or sometimes Købmandnahav, the merchant's harbour, a purely practical name for a purely practical purpose. There was no poetry in it yet. That would come later. The Vikings who inhabited these shores were not the caricatures of popular imagination. They were traders as often as raiders, navigators, shipbuilders. They moved through the world with purpose, and Haven was one of their many nodes of exchange where Baltic amber could be traded for Flemish cloth, where Norwegian dried fish could be swapped for French wine. But 1167 is where the story truly begins, and the man at the center of it was not a king. He was a bishop, Absalon of Roskilde. His name was Absalon. Born around 1128, probably to a powerful noble family of Chaland, he was educated at the Cathedral School in Paris, one of the great intellectual centers of 12th century Europe. He returned to Denmark a man shaped by both Roman law and crusading idealism, loyal to the Danish crown and ferociously ambitious about what Denmark could become. King Valdemar I, known as Valdemar the Great, trusted Absalon completely. The two men had been raised together as foster brothers. Their bond was deep and political and useful. When Valdemar needed someone to hold the Danish coast against the raids of the Wends, a Slavic people operating from across the Baltic, he turned to Absalon. In 1167, Absalon was granted the fishing village of Haven by the king. It was a strategic gift. The harbour sat at a choke point of northern trade. Absalon understood what it could become. Within the year, Absalon began construction of a fortress on the island of Slotsholmen. It was not elegant by later standards, a wooden structure reinforced with stone, surrounded by water on most sides, sitting astride the harbour entrance. But it was effective. It was a statement. Haven was now defended. Haven was now significant. Around the fortress, the settlement grew. Merchants, craftsmen, fishermen, clergy. The Church of St. Clement, patron saint of sailors, was one of the earliest, then Saint Nicholas. Then the first hints of a market town taking root in the mud. He was the most powerful man in Denmark after the king, and some would argue he was more powerful than the king. Medieval Danish chronicler Saxo Grammaticus on Absalon. Saxo Grammaticus, the great Danish chronicler who wrote the Gesta Danorum, the first major written history of Denmark, served under Absalon's patronage. The bishop didn't just build a city, he shaped how Denmark would remember itself. Absalon died in 1201, but the city he had seeded would outlive him by centuries. He never saw what it would become. He only built the first stone. Nearly 200 years pass. The harbour grows, a fortress of merchants. 1167, 1400. After Absalon, the town grew steadily, if not spectacularly. Under Bishop Absalon's successors and the Danish crown, Haven continued its role as a commercial harbour. Ships came from the Hanseatic trading cities of the Baltic coast, Lübeck, Hamburg, Rostock, laden with grain, metals and cloth. They left with fish, primarily herring, which was then at the height of its economic importance in Northern Europe. Herring, of all things, was what first made Copenhagen rich. Every autumn, vast schools of herring would migrate through the Øresund Strait, so dense contemporaries reported that you could nearly walk across them. The Scania market, held along both shores of the strait, was one of the great annual commercial events of medieval Northern Europe. Merchants from across the continent gathered to buy, salt, barrel, and ship the fish back to Catholic Europe, where dietary law required fish consumption on Fridays and holy days throughout the year. Copenhagen sat at the gate of all this activity. Not yet the dominant city of Denmark that was still Roskilde, the ecclesiastical capital, but growing in confidence and wealth. The fortress on Slotsholmen was rebuilt and reinforced. The town received its first city charter, its first formal legal identity in 1254, issued by Archbishop Jakob Erlendsson. It was a document that said, in essence, this place matters. These people have rights. The Black Death arrived in Denmark around 1350, carried along exactly the trade routes that had made the harbour prosperous. Perhaps a third of the Danish population perished within a generation. Copenhagen was not spared. We have no reliable individual accounts of the plague years in Have. What we know is archaeological and statistical. Mass burials have been found. Settlements contracted. The rhythms of trade were disrupted for a generation. But the city survived, trade returned, and the herring kept coming. The power struggle. The 14th century brought not just plague but political complexity. The Hanseatic League, the powerful federation of German merchant cities, had enormous influence over Scandinavian trade. At various points, Hanseatic merchants controlled a significant share of Copenhagen's commerce, their counting houses lining the harbour, their ships outnumbering Danish vessels in the port. This tension between local ambition and foreign economic power would define much of Copenhagen's early development. The city wanted to be a trade hub. Being a trade hub meant tolerating foreign merchants. Tolerating foreign merchants meant, at times, losing control of your own economy. It was a dilemma that would take centuries to fully resolve. Then, in 1416, a king chose this harbour town as his home, and everything changed. The rise of a capital. 1,400. 1,660. The transformation of Copenhagen from a prosperous harbour town into the capital of a Scandinavian empire can be dated, with unusual precision, to a single decision. In 1416, King Erik of Pomerania, who ruled under the Kalmar Union, which had joined Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under a single crown, decided to make Copenhagen his primary residence. He took over Copenhagen Castle on Slotsholmen and began to expand it. He built churches, he paved streets, he invited scholars, craftsmen, and clergy. Perhaps more consequentially, in 1429, Erik began charging the sound toll, a tax on every ship that passed through the Øresund. For the next 400 years, this toll would be one of the primary sources of Danish royal revenue. At its peak, the sound toll accounted for 2/3 of the Danish crown's income. It was, in economic terms, one of the most productive geographic bottlenecks in the history of European commerce. The wealth the toll generated was poured back into Copenhagen. Under a succession of ambitious monarchs, the city was steadily built up, fortified, and embellished. In 1479, the University of Copenhagen was founded by King Christian I, one of the oldest universities in Scandinavia, which would later nurture some of the greatest minds in European history. Reformation and consolidation. In 1536, the Protestant Reformation arrived in Denmark with characteristic decisiveness. King Christian III, freshly victorious in a civil war against Catholic forces, formally established the Lutheran Church as the state religion. Catholic bishops were arrested, monasteries were dissolved. The wealth of the Catholic Church, considerable, was transferred to the crown. For Copenhagen, the Reformation was not just a theological event. It was a redistribution of urban space. Former monasteries became hospitals, schools, and storehouses. The physical footprint of the city was reorganized around the new civic and royal institutions that Lutheranism, with its emphasis on the state's role in religion, tended to create. The University of Copenhagen, briefly closed during the Reformation upheaval, was refounded in 1537 along Protestant lines. It would grow into the intellectual powerhouse of the Danish-Norwegian realm. Christian IV, the Builder King. Of all the monarchs who shaped Copenhagen, none left a more visible mark than Christian IV, who reigned from 1588 to 1648, one of the longest reigns in Danish history. Christian IV was, in the most precise sense, a builder. He had been educated in the Renaissance tradition, steeped in architecture, cartography, and military engineering. He looked at Copenhagen and saw not what it was, but what it could be. And he spent a lifetime and a treasury trying to realize that vision. Under his reign, the city expanded dramatically. He founded the neighborhood of Christianshavn in 1617, built on artificial islands reclaimed from the harbor, modeled partly on Amsterdam's canal architecture. He constructed the Rosenborg Castle, which still stands today, its Dutch Renaissance towers rising above the royal garden. He built the Round Tower in 1642, a combined observatory and church tower, still the oldest functioning observatory in Europe. The Bursen, the old stock exchange, with its extraordinary spire formed by the twisted tails of 4 bronze dragons, dates from his reign. It was a statement about Copenhagen's ambitions. This city was not merely a royal court, it was a center of European commerce, science, and culture. But Christian IV's ambitions were not only architectural. He wanted Denmark to dominate Northern Europe militarily. He intervened in the 30 Years' War. He launched campaigns against Sweden, and in this, he failed catastrophically. By 1648, when he died, Denmark had lost significant territory to Sweden. The treasury was depleted. The man who had built so much had, through military hubris, left Denmark smaller and weaker than he found it. He was the greatest builder Denmark ever had, and perhaps its most reckless gambler. Historian characterization of Christian IV. His contradictions would define Danish memory of him forever. He is still, surveys consistently show, the most beloved figure in Danish history. The builder who gambled and lost. The romantic who drank too much and built too much and fought too hard. The man who gave Copenhagen its skyline. The catastrophe of 1658. In the winter of 1658, the Swedish king, Charles X Gustav, made a military gamble of breathtaking audacity. The Great Belt, the body of water separating the Danish islands, froze solid in an unprecedented cold snap. Charles led his army across the ice on foot, cavalry, and artillery. No one had ever done it before. No one believed it was possible. Within weeks, Swedish forces were outside Copenhagen. Denmark, utterly unprepared, was forced to the negotiating table. The Treaty of Roskilde, signed in February 1658, stripped Denmark of roughly a third of its territory, including the provinces of Scania, Blekinge, and Halland, which had been Danish since time immemorial. The Øresund, once entirely within Danish control, now had a Swedish shore. The Sound Toll became a contested issue. Denmark would never again be the dominant power of the north. The citizens of Copenhagen had watched Swedish troops approach their walls. They had survived, but the Denmark they knew, the expansive, assertive Denmark of Absalon and Christian IV, was gone. What remains is stripped to its core. From loss, a new kind of state is born. Fire and flood. 1660, 1800. The humiliation of Roskilde had one immediate political consequence. It destroyed the credibility of the Danish nobility, who had failed so spectacularly to defend the kingdom. In 1660, at a great assembly in Copenhagen, King Frederick III broke the centuries-old power of the aristocracy in a single act of political theatre. He declared absolute monarchy. Denmark became one of the most thoroughgoing absolutist states in Europe, more so than France, more so than Austria. The king's word was law, unchecked by parliament or nobility. In 1665, the Lex Regia, the royal law, codified this arrangement. It was one of the first written constitutions in European history, and one of the most autocratic. Copenhagen, as the seat of this absolute power, became the focus of enormous royal investment and control. New institutions, new streets, new fortifications. The city was rationalizing itself, trying to become the capital that its monarchs imagined. Then fire came, the Great Fire of 1728. On the night of the 20th of October, 1728, a fire broke out in a house near the Vesterport, the western gate of the city. The initial cause was mundane. A candle, probably, left unattended. But what followed was catastrophic. Copenhagen, in 1728, was a city of wood and thatch and closely packed buildings. The streets between houses were narrow enough to touch both sides. In the dry autumn air, with a wind from the north, fire moved like a living thing. For 4 days and 3 nights, the fire raged. By the time it finally burned itself out, approximately 1,600 buildings had been destroyed, nearly a third of the entire city. 5 churches were leveled. The University of Copenhagen, with its library of thousands of irreplaceable manuscripts, burned to the ground. An estimated 20% of Copenhagen's population was left homeless overnight. Consider what was lost in those medieval manuscripts. The accumulated writing of centuries, religious texts, legal records, personal correspondences, sagas, chronicles, most of it gone in hours. The fire of 1728 created a gap in the documentary record of Danish history that scholars have mourned ever since. The rebuilding was rapid and deliberate. The new Copenhagen that rose from the ashes in the 1730s and 1740s was built in stone and brick. Streets were widened, building codes were imposed. The city that emerged was more durable, more regular, more planned. It was also, inevitably, less medieval. Something old had burned away, something newer, more rational, had taken its place. The Second Great Fire, 1795. 67 years later, fire came again. The Great Fire of 1795 broke out on June 5 inches, the Gamelholm district, the Navy Yard area east of the city centre. Again, the conditions were terrible. Dry summer air, closely packed wooden structures among even the rebuilt areas, insufficient water supplies. The fire burned for 3 days, destroying over 1,000 homes and leaving 6,000 people homeless. Among the losses were significant portions of the old medieval city core that had survived 1728. A second generation of residents watched their city burn. But this time, the recovery was different. The city had learned, partly, from the previous disaster, and the rebuilding of post-1795 Copenhagen brought neoclassical architecture, wider boulevards, and the first systematic efforts at urban planning. Copenhagen was becoming, in spite of everything, or perhaps because of everything, a more modern city. By the end of the 18th century, Copenhagen had grown to approximately 100,000 inhabitants, making it one of the largest cities in Northern Europe. It was a city of coffeehouses and theatres, of scientific societies and Enlightenment salons. The absolute monarchy had, paradoxically, created a court culture of considerable sophistication. Astronomers worked in the Round Tower. Philosophers debated in the university. The Royal Theatre staged operas and ballets. Danish literature, long overshadowed by German culture, was beginning to find its own voice. And then, from across the North Sea, came the sound of guns. The night the ships came, 1807, in the summer of 1807, Napoleon Bonaparte dominated continental Europe as no single power had since Rome. Britain stood alone, blockaded, besieged in every economic and diplomatic sense. And Britain was afraid. The Danish fleet was one of the most formidable in the world. 12 ships of the line, along with frigates and smaller vessels. Britain had intelligence suggesting that Napoleon intended to force Denmark into an alliance, adding the Danish fleet to his already dominant naval power. After the destruction of the French fleet at Trafalgar in 1805, the British Admiralty could not tolerate such a prospect. Denmark, for its part, was neutral, had been neutral throughout the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Crown Prince Frederick, ruling in the absence of the mentally incapacitated, King Christian VII, had walked a careful diplomatic line, trading with all sides, offending none. Britain demanded he hand over the fleet. Frederick refused. Denmark was neutral. It had done nothing wrong. To surrender its navy would be to surrender its sovereignty. In late July, 1807, a British fleet of over 400 ships and naval vessels and transports appeared off the Danish coast. An army of nearly 30,000 soldiers landed on Sjælland. The British commander, Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, led the land forces. They encircled Copenhagen. The population inside the city was perhaps 100,000 souls. The defending garrison was perhaps a few thousand, barely adequate. The bombardment began on the night of the 2nd of September, 1807. The bombardment. For 3 days and nights, the British fleet fired on Copenhagen. They used a weapon that had recently been perfected, the Congreve rocket, an incendiary device that set fire to rooftops and spread rapidly. On the night of September 4, fires took hold across multiple districts simultaneously. The city that had twice burned in the 18th century burned again. More than 1,000 civilians died. Approximately 300 buildings were destroyed, including the Cathedral of Our Lady, which was struck by a rocket and collapsed in flames. Thousands more buildings were damaged. The cathedral's irreplaceable medieval interior, accumulated over centuries, was simply gone. On the 7th of September 1807, with the city still smouldering, the Danish government surrendered the fleet. The British took 18 ships of the line, 15 frigates, and 31 smaller vessels in total, the most powerful single seizure of naval assets in modern history up to that point. Denmark, humiliated and enraged, immediately allied with Napoleon. The neutrality that had served it for years was shattered. It would fight on the French side for the remainder of the Napoleonic Wars, and it would lose. At the Congress of Vienna in 1814, Denmark was stripped of Norway, which it had ruled since 1397. The Danish-Norwegian Union, 400 years old, ended. They took our ships and our neutrality in a single night. They left us the ruins of both. Danish historical sentiment from the period. The bombardment of 1807 has never entirely left Danish cultural memory. To this day, it remains a defining wound. The British, in Copenhagen's historical consciousness, did something unconscionable. They attacked a neutral city without declaration of war on the basis of what they feared Denmark might do. History, as it turned out, would suggest they may have been strategically right, but right and just are different things. And Copenhagen rebuilt again. Plague, poverty, and progress. 1807, 1870. Copenhagen, in the decades after 1807, was a city under pressure. Its population grew rapidly, from roughly 100,000 at the turn of the century to nearly 130,000 by 1850, while the housing stock, damaged by bombardment and still recovering, struggled to keep pace. The working-class neighborhoods near the harbor and the older districts of the city were becoming dangerously overcrowded. Sanitation was primitive. The city's drinking water came from wells that were, in many districts, barely a few meters from cesspits. Streets were unpaved. Sewage ran in open gutters. In the densely packed slum districts, families of 6 or 8 lived in single rooms. This was a city waiting for a catastrophe. The cholera epidemic of 1853. Cholera had appeared in Europe in repeated waves since 1831. Copenhagen had been lucky or cautious in earlier outbreaks, avoiding the worst of the first and second cholera pandemics. By 1853, some city officials had grown complacent. The epidemic arrived in June of that year, carried in trade traffic from infected ports. The first cases appeared in the harbor districts. Within weeks, it had spread to every neighborhood. Cholera is a brutal disease. In its acute form, it kills within hours extreme dehydration from violent diarrhea and vomiting, the body consuming itself. In the slums of Copenhagen, where people shared contaminated water sources, one sick person could infect dozens. By the end of the summer of 1853, approximately 4,700 people had died in Copenhagen. roughly 3.5% of the entire city population, in a matter of months. That figure, translated to modern Copenhagen, would be equivalent to losing nearly 20,000 people in a single season. The epidemic exposed the catastrophic inadequacy of the city's infrastructure with brutal clarity. It also exposed the inequality embedded in that infrastructure. The wealthy neighborhoods in the north of the city, with better housing and cleaner water, suffered far less than the working-class south. Disease followed poverty with statistical precision. The city's response, in the epidemic's aftermath, was ultimately transformative. A new sewage system was designed and began construction in the 1850s. New water mains brought cleaner water to more districts. Urban planning, which had been a luxury and an aesthetic concern, became a matter of survival. Over the following decades, Copenhagen undertook what can only be described as a radical reinvention of its infrastructure. The old fortifications that had ringed the city now obsolete, as military defenses were gradually demolished and replaced by parks and boulevards. The city expanded outward into the suburbs for the first time. The cholera epidemic of 1853, as horrifying as it was, accelerated modernization by decades. Cities often learn their most important lessons from their worst disasters. But while the city struggled with its physical survival, its mind was working overtime. The golden age of dreamers, 1800, 1900. The 19th century was, paradoxically, the era of Copenhagen's greatest intellectual and cultural flowering, a golden age that emerged directly from the shadow of political and military decline. When you lose an empire, perhaps you look inward. When you can no longer define yourself by power, you reach for something else: meaning, beauty, truth. Three figures, above all, embody what Copenhagen produced in this extraordinary century. And they could not have been more different from one another. Hans Christian Andersen, the man who was his own fairy tale. He was born in 1805 inches. Odense, the son of a cobbler and a washerwoman. His father died young. His mother was an alcoholic. He grew up in poverty with a passionate, embarrassing hunger for the theatre, for beauty, for escape, for the world of imagination. At 14, he walked to Copenhagen. Literally walked. Most of the journey with almost nothing in his pockets and a letter of introduction to the director of the Royal Theatre. He was awkward, ugly by conventional standards, prone to weeping in public, openly desperate for approval. He was also, already, possessed of something rare. A gift for seeing the world as if for the first time, every time. The city did not exactly welcome him. He failed as an actor. He failed as a singer. He failed as a dancer. For years, he survived on charity and patronage, brilliant but unformed. A provincial boy who refused to accept that he did not belong. Then he found the fairy tale. Not as a children's genre he initially despised being associated with children's writing, but as a philosophical form, a way of exploring the deepest human hungers for love, for belonging, for transformation through images of magical simplicity. The Little Mermaid, published in 1837, is not really a children's story. It is a meditation on longing that cannot be satisfied, on the desire to belong to a world that will never fully accept you. It is, scholars have long argued, autobiographical in its deepest structure. Andersen was gay in an era that had no language for it. He formed intense, largely unrequited attachments to men, including the Danish dancer Harald Scharf and the Swedish singer Jenny Lind. His stories are saturated with the pathos of love that cannot be spoken or consummated. The whole world is a series of miracles, but we're so used to them, we call them ordinary things. Hans Christian Andersen. By the time he died, in 1875, Andersen was the most famous Dane alive. His stories had been translated into dozens of languages. He had dined with kings and been feted in literary salons across Europe. The ugly duckling had become a swan, though he never quite believed it. Copenhagen today is, in many ways, the city he dreamed of from the outside. His statue near the town hall sits with its back to Tivoli Gardens, the amusement park he loved. He is looking toward the city that rejected him, then embraced him, then made him its symbol. Søren Kierkegaard, the man who argued with God. Søren Kierkegaard was born in Copenhagen in Etusende og Århundrede og 13, the youngest son of a prosperous hosier. His father, Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard, was a deeply religious man tormented by guilt. He believed, apparently, that he had once cursed God as a young man, and that his family was under a divine curse as a consequence. Søren grew up in the shadow of that guilt. Of his 7 siblings, 5 died young. So did his mother. The weight of mortality, of meaning, of God's silence in the face of human suffering, these were not abstract theological questions for Kierkegaard. They were the texture of his daily life. He studied theology at the University of Copenhagen, but was drawn more to philosophy and literature. He wrote prolifically, often under pseudonyms, each pseudonym representing a different philosophical stance, a different way of being in the world. It was a literary device of breathtaking sophistication. By putting ideas in the mouths of invented personas, Kierkegaard forced his readers to judge the ideas on their merits, not his authority. He walked Copenhagen constantly. Friends and acquaintances commented that he seemed to know everyone in the city by sight, that his daily walks through the streets were a kind of extended philosophical seminar with whoever he encountered. He believed in the street as a space of democratic encounter, the philosopher among the fishwives and cobblers and clerks. The most common form of despair is not being who you are. Søren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard's great project was a sustained argument against what he saw as the comfortable complacency of bourgeois Christianity, the idea that one could be religious by simply following social conventions without ever confronting the terrifying demands of genuine faith. His concept of the leap of faith, the idea that authentic religious commitment requires a radical, non-rational act of commitment that cannot be secured by reason alone, would become one of the founding ideas of existentialism, influencing Nietzsche, Heidegger, Sartre, and Camus in the following century. He died in 1855, at 42, exhausted from an extraordinary decade of writing. Copenhagen's cultural establishment, whom he had attacked savagely in his final years in a pamphlet campaign against the Danish state church, gave him a mixed funeral. History was less ambivalent. He is now widely considered one of the most significant philosophers of the 19th century. His birthplace is a museum. His grave, in the Assistens Cemetery, is a pilgrimage site. Niels Bohr, the man who divided the atom. No survey of Copenhagen's intellectual heritage can stop at the 19th century, because the city's most consequential scientific mind was born in 1885 on the cusp of a new era. Niels Bohr was born into one of Copenhagen's intellectual elite families. His father was a professor of physiology, his mother from a prominent Jewish banking family. He grew up in a household where science and scholarship were the air one breathed. His contributions to quantum mechanics, beginning in the early 20th century, helped transform our understanding of the subatomic world. His model of the atom, developed in 1913, placed electrons in quantized orbits, the first major departure from classical physics into what would become quantum theory. In 1920, Bohr established the Institute for Theoretical Physics in Copenhagen, later renamed the Niels Bohr Institute, which became, through the 1920s and 1930s, arguably the most important center for theoretical physics in the world. Werner Heisenberg, Wolfgang Pauli, Erwin Schrödinger, Paul Dirac, the giants of quantum mechanics, all passed through Copenhagen. The institute was a crucible. If quantum mechanics hasn't profoundly shocked you, you haven't understood it yet. Niels Bohr, the city that had produced a philosopher of radical interiority and a storyteller of magical simplicity, now produced a physicist who revealed that reality, at its most fundamental level, was stranger than any fairy tale. But history was not finished with Copenhagen. The darkest chapter was yet to come. The occupation. April 9, 1940. May 5, 1945. On the morning of the 9th of April, 1940, the citizens of Copenhagen woke to the sound of aircraft. German bombers flew low over the city in the early hours. German warships steamed into the harbor. German soldiers, moving with the methodical efficiency of an army that had already conquered Poland and was in the process of dismantling Western Europe, occupied the city with a speed that left the Danish government paralyzed. The Danish army fought back, briefly, in scattered engagements. At Amalienborg Palace, the royal guard exchanged fire with German soldiers in the early morning darkness. 13 Danish soldiers and 2 German soldiers died. Then it was over. Within hours, the Danish government had capitulated. The decision to capitulate was not cowardice, it was a calculation. The German forces were vastly superior. Resistance would have been obliterated in days and would have resulted in civilian massacres. The government chose instead a policy of negotiated cooperation, attempting to preserve Danish institutions, Danish law, and above all the Danish Jewish community from the worst of Nazi racial policy. For the first 3 years of the occupation, this strategy worked. After a fashion, Denmark retained its government, its king, its police, its courts. German soldiers walked the streets of Copenhagen, but did not run its daily life. King Christian X famously rode his horse through the city streets each morning without a military escort, a deliberate act of visible Danish sovereignty. There is a story, possibly apocryphal, but deeply cherished, that when Germany demanded the king fly a swastika flag from Amalienborg Palace, Christian X replied that if such a flag were flown, a Danish soldier would take it down. When a German official threatened that the soldier would be shot, the king reportedly replied, "That soldier will be me." The story may be legend. The spirit it captures is not. The rescue of the Danish Jews. In the autumn of 1943, the situation changed dramatically. The German occupiers, frustrated by Danish resistance and emboldened by events elsewhere in Europe, decided to move against Denmark's approximately 7,500 Jewish citizens in a roundup planned for the night of October 1-2. Word leaked. A German naval attaché named Georg Ferdinand Duckwitz informed Danish contacts of the plan. Within hours, the news was spreading through Copenhagen's networks passed person to person through church congregations, professional associations, neighborhood contacts. What followed over the next 3 weeks was one of the most extraordinary rescue operations of the Second World War. Ordinary Danes, fishermen, teachers, doctors, students, housewives, harbor workers organized an improvised rescue network. Jewish families were hidden in homes, churches, hospitals, and summer cottages along the coast. Fishing boats were chartered, bribed, or volunteered. In night crossings, across the Øresund, under constant threat of German patrol boats, approximately 7,000 Danish Jews were ferried to safety in neutral Sweden. A further 500 were captured and deported to Theresienstadt concentration camp in Czechoslovakia. The Danish government and Danish Red Cross actively lobbied the German authorities on their behalf throughout the war. An extraordinary 97% of those deported survived, a survival rate almost unparalleled among deported Jewish populations in occupied Europe. They were our neighbors, our friends, our colleagues. What else would we do? A Danish rescuer, when asked why they helped, this is the answer Danes gave and give. It was not heroism, they insist. It was simply human decency, perhaps. But human decency, in occupied Europe in 1943, was not so common that its consistent exercise in a single city could be taken for granted. Copenhagen chose its response. It deserves to be held. Liberation. On the 4th of May, 1945, BBC Radio broadcast the news that German forces in Denmark had surrendered. The date of formal liberation was May 5. The city erupted. People who had lived for 5 years under the constraint of occupation, 5 years of curfews and rationing, and the ever-present weight of armed foreign control poured into the streets. Candles appeared in windows across the city, a prearranged signal that had been waiting for this moment. The darkness lifted, literally and metaphorically, all at once. The occupation had lasted 1,856 days. A city that survived fire, bombardment, plague, and occupation now faced the question every survivor eventually must ask: what do we build next? Rebuilding and reimagining. 1945, 2000. The Copenhagen that emerged from the Second World War was physically intact. It had, remarkably, been spared the destruction visited on so many European cities, but it faced the challenges of the post-war era. with the same combination of resourcefulness and pragmatism that had always characterized its people. Denmark, in 1945, was a small country of roughly 4 million people, without significant natural resources, dependent on trade and agriculture. It had survived the war by navigating impossible choices. Now it had to decide what kind of society it wanted to be. The answer it reached, over the next 2 decades, was one of the most consequential political experiments of the 20th century: building the welfare state. Denmark had begun building its welfare state before the war, with social democratic governments in the 1930s establishing early frameworks for unemployment insurance, old age pensions, and healthcare access. After 1945, the project accelerated dramatically. The vision was, at its core, a simple one: a society in which no citizen would be destroyed by bad luck, where illness, job loss, or old age would not mean destitution, where education would be available to everyone, regardless of birth or wealth. Copenhagen, as the capital and largest city, was the laboratory and the showcase of this project. New housing districts spread outward from the city. Public schools and hospitals were built with the kind of architectural attention usually reserved for monuments. By the 1960s, Denmark was achieving among the lowest poverty rates and highest life expectancies in the world. It came at a cost: high taxes, a strong regulatory state, but the bargain, evidently, was one that most Danes accepted. Survey after survey throughout the latter 20th century found Denmark among the highest-ranking countries in the world for reported life satisfaction. The Finger Plan of 1947 was one of the most influential urban planning documents of post-war Europe. It envisioned Copenhagen's growth not as an expanding ring, the model most European cities followed, but as 5 fingers of development extending from the historic centre, following rail corridors, with green spaces preserved between them. The plan remains in force, in updated form, to this day. It is why Copenhagen has both density and greenery, the 2 things urbanists now consider essential to a livable city: turbulence and transformation. The 1960s arrived in Copenhagen as they arrived everywhere, with generational tension, countercultural ferment, and a questioning of all previously settled assumptions. The city's youth engaged with the broader currents of European and American radicalism, while adding distinctly Danish flavors. A strong tradition of consensus politics, a deep cultural skepticism of authority and pretension, a commitment to individual freedom that sometimes expressed itself in genuinely radical ways. In September 1971, a group of activists broke down the fence of an abandoned military base in the Christianshavn district and declared it a free town. They called it Christiania. Christiania was, and remains, one of the longest-running communal social experiments in European history. Several hundred people established homes there, organized on collectively agreed principles that rejected conventional property ownership and state authority. The Danish government, after initially attempting to remove the community, eventually settled into an uneasy tolerance. Today, Christiania remains home to roughly 1,000 permanent residents, a major tourist attraction, and a space of ongoing negotiation between the community and the Danish state. It produces extraordinary cognitive dissonance, a self-declared anarchist commune within a welfare state, itself within the European Union. Copenhagen, characteristically, has concluded that it can live with the contradiction, the environmental turn. In the 1970s, like many Western cities, Copenhagen was becoming dominated by the automobile. Traffic choked the historic centre. Air quality was deteriorating. The harbour, once the lifeblood of the city, for centuries the first thing visitors saw was so polluted that swimming in it was unthinkable. Beginning in the late 1970s and accelerating through the 1980s and 1990s, Copenhagen made a series of decisions that would, by the early 21st century, make it internationally famous as a model of sustainable urban design. The bicycle emerged as the city's signature form of transport, not through accident or natural inclination, but through deliberate investment. Cycle lanes were built, car lanes were removed. In 1980, perhaps 15% of Copenhageners cycled to work. By the early 21st century, the figure exceeded 60%. The harbour was cleaned. By 2002, It was clean enough to swim in a transformation that would have been incomprehensible to a resident of the 1970s. Urban beaches were created along the waterfront. The harbour, after centuries of industrial use, became a civic amenity once more. Copenhagen arrives at the 21st century, carrying everything it has been, and decides to become something new. The city of today, Døjes Mill, present. Copenhagen in the 21st century has become, paradoxically, one of the most discussed cities on Earth. A place smaller than Houston, less known historically than Rome or Paris, which has somehow become a reference point for how a city might organize itself in a century of climate anxiety, urban inequality, and democratic stress. The Öresund Bridge, opened in 2000, connected Copenhagen to Malmö, Sweden, for the first time in history, creating, overnight, a binational metropolitan region of over 4 million people. The two cities, which had spent centuries as rivals, separated by the same stretch of water where the Battle of the Sound was once fought, were now physically linked by a rail and road crossing of remarkable engineering ambition. In 2001, Copenhagen opened its first metro line. In 2019, after years of construction that cut across the city's most ancient layers of underground archaeology, the City Ringen, a circular metro ring connecting the centre to outer neighbourhoods, opened, reshaping how the city moved. The Copenhagen Metro project, during its years of construction, was one of the most intensive archaeological excavations in Danish history. Almost every station excavation revealed layers of medieval and post-medieval material: pottery, leather shoes, animal bones, building foundations, the physical residue of 8 centuries of continuous urban life. Architecture for the 21st century. The early 21st century brought a wave of ambitious architecture to Copenhagen's waterfront and outer neighbourhoods. Jørgen Utzon, the Danish architect who had designed the Sydney Opera House in the 1950s, one of the most recognisable buildings in the world, returned to national prominence. His son, Jan Utzon, continued the family legacy of innovative Danish design. The Copenhagen Opera House, designed by Henning Larsen and opened in Tutusina of Fem, sits directly across the harbour from Amalienborg Palace, a glass and steel structure in pointed conversation with the Baroque royalism on the opposite shore. It was funded almost entirely by the Maersk Shipping Company, one of the largest in the world, and a Danish corporation, as a gift to the city. The harbour itself became a laboratory of urban transformation. Industrial zones gave way to mixed-use waterfront developments. New residential neighbourhoods rose on former shipping wharves. The relationship between the city and its water, always the foundational relationship. The reason the city existed was renegotiated once more. Gastronomy and soft power. In 2003, a restaurant opened in a converted 18th century warehouse on the Copenhagen waterfront. Its name was Noma, a contraction of Nordic, and mad, the Danish word for food. Noma and its head chef, René Redzepi, would go on to be named the best restaurant in the world 4 times between 2010 and 2021. More significantly, they pioneered what became known as New Nordic cuisine, a philosophical approach to cooking that emphasized local and seasonal Scandinavian ingredients, fermentation, foraging, and the revaluation of Nordic food traditions that had been dismissed for centuries as provincial. The influence of Noma and its alumni network spread across global gastronomy with a speed that no one had anticipated. Copenhagen, previously not a city associated with culinary sophistication, became a required pilgrimage for the world's serious food community. Chefs from Tokyo, New York, and Sao Paulo came to work in its kitchens and returned home with fundamentally altered ideas about what food could be. The food revolution was, in a sense, a metaphor. Copenhagen had taken something that seemed modest, local, even limiting its northern geography, its cold climate, its particular ecology, and transformed those apparent limitations into a distinctive identity and a global cultural export. It was, historians might note, not the first time. Climate capital. No city in the world has set more ambitious public climate targets than Copenhagen. In 2009, the city government committed to becoming carbon neutral by 2025, a goal that, as the deadline approached, required difficult revisions, but remained a statement of intent, unlike any other major city in the world. The commitment was not merely rhetorical. Copenhagen has systematically rebuilt its energy infrastructure around renewable sources, particularly offshore wind, in which Danish companies are global leaders. District heating systems pipe thermal energy through much of the city. New buildings are required to meet strict efficiency standards. The cycling infrastructure, expanded further, moves hundreds of thousands of people through the city daily without carbon emissions. The harbour, cleaned from industrial pollution in the 1980s and 1990s, now hosts Copenhagen's harbour baths, urban swimming spots that are among the most used public spaces in the city. Children swim where cargo ships once unloaded coal. This is, in its way, the most dramatic reversal in the city's long history. The harbour, which was always the city's economic purpose, has become its public garden, memory and identity. Copenhagen today is a city deeply engaged with the question of what to remember and how. The 1807 bombardment, an event that shaped the city's relationship with Britain and with the very concept of neutrality, is extensively documented in its museums. The October 1943 rescue of the Danish Jews is commemorated in the Danish Jewish Museum, designed by Daniel Libeskind in the ruins of the old royal boathouse in the heart of the historic city. The museum's floor plan is based on the Hebrew letters that spell Mizwah, a good deed. You cannot walk its corridors in a straight line. The disorientation is deliberate. Memory, Libeskind suggests, is not a straight line either. Copenhagen's relationship with its own history has never been simple. It is a city that lost an empire and found its way, that burned twice and rebuilt twice, that was bombarded without warning and found, eventually, a way to move past bitterness, that was occupied by a criminal regime and, in its most human moment, chose decency over complicity. In the Assistance Cemetery in the Nørrebro neighborhood, Hans Christian Andersen and Søren Kierkegaard are buried within walking distance of each other. Both men spent their lives in this city, loved it, raged against it, were shaped and scarred by it. One created stories that have comforted and disturbed children and adults across 2 centuries. The other asked questions that philosophers are still trying to answer. The storyteller and the philosopher, the city that made them both. There is a city at the edge of Europe. It is the size of a mid-sized American city. It has no oil, no dominant military, no global empire. Its language is spoken by fewer than 6 million people. Its winters are cold and dark, its summers brief and luminous. And yet, architects study it, urban planners cite it, philosophers are buried there, fairy tales live in it. The world's greatest chefs learned something there about what food could mean. Physicists argued over quantum theory in its university buildings. Fishermen in the 10th century drove stakes into its shallows without knowing they were beginning something that would last 1,000 years. It has been defined by what it survived: fire and plague and bombardment and occupation, and also by what it created in the spaces between disasters: beauty, thought, music, architecture, literature, and a peculiarly Nordic vision of what a society might owe its members. No city in history is a simple story. Copenhagen is not simple. It burned and rebuilt. It conquered and was conquered. It was neutral when it shouldn't have been, and defiant when defiance was almost impossible. It produced a philosopher who challenged every comfortable belief, and a storyteller who wrapped difficult truths in beautiful lies. The water under the Øresund Bridge is the same water that lapped the muddy shores where Absalon built his fortress. The light on the harbour is the same light that illuminated the fires of 1728 and 1795, and the rockets of 1807. Nothing is the same. Everything continues. That is what cities do. That is what this one, in particular, has always done.